Welcome to Psycast. Let's talk about the quiet fear that intelligence can provoke and what it really means to carry a mind that sees too much. There's something strange that happens when you're deeply perceptive in a world that prefers simplicity. At first, people admire your insight. They'll call you wise, sharp, even brilliant. But stay long enough, speak honestly enough, and a shift begins. Admiration turns to unease. Curiosity becomes caution. You start to notice the silence that follows when you name what others were trying not to see. And if you've felt that, if you've watched someone's face change after you spoke a truth too raw or asked a question too real, you've felt the very thing Kafka once lived through. A world that doesn't know what to do with a mind it can't control. He once wrote, "I am a cage in search of a bird." Not because he lacked ideas, but because he lived in a world afraid of what his mind might set free. Maybe no one told you this before, but intelligence, real intelligence, isn't just about knowing things. It's about seeing the layers beneath things. It's about asking why when everyone else is content with how. It's not always comfortable to be around, because truth, when spoken with clarity, can feel like a mirror being held too close. That's why some of the wisest people you'll ever meet also carry loneliness like a second skin. It's not that they push people away. It's that the world often pushes back, not because it hates intelligence, but because it fears what intelligence reveals. Let me tell you something I once heard that stayed with me. Some people don't want to be understood, because if you understand them, you can see through them, and not everyone is ready to be seen. The fear isn't of you, it's of what your mind sees, what it notices, what it can't unsee. I think that's one of the hardest things to carry when you have a mind that doesn't rest on the surface. It's not just the weight of what you know, it's the loneliness of what others won't admit. It's watching people pretend not to see what's obvious to you. It's feeling like you're speaking a language no one wants to translate. And after a while, you start to ask yourself, is it me? Maybe I'm too intense. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe I should just play along. But here's the truth you might need to hear today. Your depth isn't the problem. It never was. We live in a world built to reward performance, not perception. There's a comfort in things being easily digestible, in people being predictable. So when you show up with complexity, with nuance, with questions that dig too deep, or thoughts that stretch too far, you unsettle that comfort. You interrupt the performance. That's why smart people, truly thoughtful, sensitive, internally rich people, can be met not with reverence, but with rejection. Especially when their intelligence is quiet, unassuming, emotional. Not the kind that dominates a room, but the kind that makes people feel seen in ways they weren't ready for. Carl Jung said something that speaks to this. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But what he didn't say is that some people don't want to be transformed. They want to stay where they are, unchanged, untouched, safe. And when your presence starts to stir something in them, when your questions make them uncomfortable with their answers, the instinct is to pull away, to shut down the conversation, to dismiss you as too much or overthinking. That's not a failure on your part. It's the cost of seeing clearly in a world that profits from people looking away. Sometimes, when people say you're intimidating, what they really mean is, you make me question things I've avoided for too long. And they don't always have the language for that. So they call it arrogance, coldness, distance. But you and I both know, it's not distance, it's depth. And the deeper you go, the fewer people are willing to follow. And maybe that's what Kafka understood better than most. That being awake in a sleeping world is a kind of exile. That speaking truth in a language of denial will always sound like madness to those who aren't ready to hear it. But still, you speak, you see, you feel, you think. And maybe that's not something to be ashamed of, but something to guard, tenderly, fiercely. There's a certain kind of grief that comes with being mentally alive in a world that often encourages emotional sedation. It's the grief of being misunderstood. Not because you failed to communicate, but because what you're saying doesn't fit within the narrative others are trying to protect. If you've ever been told, you think too much, what they might have meant was, You're making me think more than I'm comfortable with. If you've ever been labeled difficult, complicated, or too intense, maybe it wasn't because you were hard to understand, but because you couldn't be easily controlled. And that's frightening to people who equate understanding with power. The world doesn't fear intelligence in textbooks. It fears intelligence that breathes, intelligence that disrupts, intelligence that feels. Because when smart people start connecting the dots between systems, patterns, histories, psychologies, they become impossible to manipulate. And when they also carry empathy, that intelligence becomes a mirror too vivid to ignore. That's when the fear begins. Not the loud kind, but the subtle kind. The distance, the jokes, the attempts to minimize your voice, the sense that people hear you, but aren't really listening, that they admire your mind, as long as it doesn't touch theirs too deeply. Viktor Frankl once said, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." But what happens when the very self you're asked to change is the one that sees too clearly? Do you make yourself smaller just to stay close to others? Do you pretend not to notice the things you can't unsee just to be liked? Here's the quiet tragedy. Many people with rich inner lives learn early to perform simplicity. They learn to translate their thoughts into safer language. They nod along when they disagree. They hide their questions behind polite smiles, not because they're dishonest, but because the truth has taught them it's not always welcome. So they shrink, they camouflage, they speak less. And the world loses something precious in that process. Not just brilliance, but honesty. The kind of honesty that could have opened a door, started a healing, sparked a change. That's the paradox. The very minds that could help the world grow are the ones most often silenced by it, because they carry discomfort, disruption, truth. But here's something no one tells you. Protecting your mind is not arrogance. It's wisdom. You don't have to explain your depth to those committed to misunderstanding it. You don't have to water yourself down to quench someone else's thirst. What you hold is rare, and rarity has never been easily accepted, but it's still valuable, especially now. I've come to believe that some of the most intelligent people I've met didn't look the way intelligence is usually packaged. They didn't dominate conversations. They didn't speak in abstractions just to sound profound. They weren't loud. They were quiet, careful, deep. They watched more than they spoke. They listened with their whole being. And when they finally said something, it landed like a seed you'd carry with you for weeks. That's the kind of intelligence I'm talking about. The kind that feels more like a presence than a performance. And that kind of mind, the quiet, watchful, radically honest kind, tends to make people uncomfortable. Not because it's trying to, but because it doesn't play by the rules of small talk or social masks or the fragile scripts we're all expected to follow. This is where Kafka was right, in ways that still echo today. His writing wasn't just surreal, it was surgical. He exposed the absurdities of systems that pretend to be rational. He showed how the most civilized structures can become cages when you see through them. And more importantly, he made people feel something they couldn't name, that unease of encountering someone who doesn't just live inside the world, but sees around it. When you have a mind like that, when you notice the contradictions, the absurdities, the quiet cruelties everyone steps over, you carry a different kind of burden. You're not just thinking about the world. You're feeling what it does to people. You're holding the invisible weight of truths no one wants to speak. And there's a kind of spiritual fatigue that comes from that, from seeing too much, from feeling like you have to choose between honesty and belonging, between saying what's real and staying connected. But here's something that helped me, and maybe it will help you. It's not your job to make others comfortable with your depth. It's your job to remain rooted in it, even when it scares people, especially when it scares people. Because the world doesn't change through comfort. It changes through truth, through insight, through the quiet courage of those who refuse to unsee what's there. And sometimes that means walking alone for a while, not because you're broken, but because your path hasn't been paved yet. The people who will recognize you, really see you, won't be afraid of your mind. They'll feel at home in it. They'll breathe easier, not harder, in your presence. and you won't have to shrink for that to happen. But until then, hold your space. Protect your questions. Guard your clarity. You're not too much. You're just not easily explained. You're just not easily explained. And that's not a flaw. It's a kind of freedom, even if it doesn't always feel like it. Because what you carry isn't just intelligence. It's insight born from sensitivity. It's the kind of knowing that doesn't come from books or lectures, but from watching the world closely. From noticing the small hesitations in someone's voice, the way silence can say more than words, the ache behind a smile, the patterns in the pain. You see what others rush past. You hold what others drop. And maybe you've spent years wondering why that feels so heavy. Maybe you've blamed yourself for not being lighter, not being more adaptable. But what if the weight you carry isn't your weakness? It's your wisdom. Edith Eger, a Holocaust survivor and psychologist, once said, "What you don't feel, you can't heal." And people who think deeply often feel deeply. That's why you sometimes feel like you're drowning in things others barely notice. But that's also why you can heal in places others can't even reach. You don't just think, you metabolize experience. You digest life. That's what makes your mind not just sharp, but sacred. So if you've ever been made to feel like your intelligence is something to apologize for, don't. If you've ever been punished, socially or emotionally, for noticing too much, caring too much, thinking too deeply, don't shrink yourself to fit into that rejection. You were never meant to be invisible. Yes, some people will be afraid of your mind, not because you are dangerous, but because your presence threatens the illusions they rely on. And that's okay. Let them step back. You're not here to be palatable. You're here to be whole. One day, someone will sit across from you. Maybe a friend, maybe a lover, maybe a quiet soul who's been carrying their own thoughts like stones. And they'll look at you like a home they never thought they'd find. And they'll say something simple, but life-altering, like, "You don't scare me." And in that moment, everything will soften. Until then, let your mind be what it is. Let your questions stay sharp. Let your insight stay honest. The world needs more people who can see clearly, not fewer. You don't have to be less. You just have to keep being real. And if that means walking alone for a while, so be it. Because alone doesn't always mean lonely. Sometimes it means you're just early. And those who see clearly always arrive early. To truth, to grief, to beauty, to change. This is Psycast. And maybe today's not about changing who you are, but finally understanding why the world reacted the way it did. Because they didn't fear you. They feared your mind.